Greetings guys, as you can probably tell from the t-shirt, I'm here with another video on Dungeons and Dragons. Now I have done a video talking about D&D before, but I wanted to go back and cover some more ground, A, because I wasn't overly happy with everything that I talked about during that video, and B, because there are certain issues I have with the game. Now this video also serves as a video response to a recent video by Shad from Shadiversity. Because today I want to be talking about what kind of weapons adventurers should be using and how D&D gets the mechanics of it so incredibly wrong. So, D&D is a game that seems to, on face value, be a fantasy or a medieval inspired fantasy roleplay game, but it puts a lot of emphasis on swords. Now don't get me wrong, swords are cool, but they weren't exactly the sole weapon that medieval and feudal societies made use of. In fact, more often than not, there are plenty of accounts of other weapons such as the bow or the spear being used as frequently, if not more frequently, than a sword. So, what was it about Shad's video that got me thinking? Well, he talks his way through, from a historical point of view, about other types of weapons, and how they are worthwhile considerations. For instance, he talks a lot about the bow. Now, there are just about wherever you go in the world, there are examples of the bow. From the English longbow to the horseback archers of the Persian Empire, through to the Japanese art form of the bow. It is a reoccurring weapon throughout so much of society because it offers some very significant advantages. Most notably the fact that you can deal with your opponent without ever having to actually get within arm's reach of one another. Not to mention the fact that it is a great way of deterring enemy forces as they advance on you. And whilst Shad makes some very good points about how every D&D character or every character in a fantasy roleplay game should have a bow, and I would, to a degree, agree with him, missile weapons are a bit hit and miss. If your adventuring party happens to be wandering through the woods or going over mountains or hills or whatever, a bow is fine. In the confines of a dungeon, maybe not so much. Don't get me wrong, I think that it's useful to have, and it's certainly something to be considered for any character, not just your rangers, which typically fall into the kind of bow-twanging Legolas type archetype. And, yeah, we all know that Legolas is a CGI ninja. But, sooner or later, whether you're in an enclosed space, an open space, or whatever, your character is going to be forced to have, due to reload times, is going to be forced into hand-to-hand combat. So what do you go with then? Well, a short sword is often considered the go-to weapon. It's light, it's effective, and it offers the variety of both slashing and stabbing. I'll get the words out in a minute, bloody hell. And, yeah, there are lots of examples, in fact, of military writings, even in England, referring to every man should carry a tuck with him. A tuck was a small short sword, or precursor to the longsword, kind of between the short sword and longsword, that was primarily designed as a stabbing weapon. It was very much seen as the tuck that into your belt because it didn't have the cutting edge, so it wasn't likely to slice through your belt. But ideal for up close and personal and just getting them right in the ribs or through the kind of tiny little holes that you would get through chainmail. It was also used as a hunting weapon for stabbing boar on a boar hunt. So, swords, always a worthwhile sidearm. But when it comes to primary arms, D&D seems to lean heavily into the idea that you want great axe or great swords. Which is kind of weird because probably the oldest and most historically documented weapon everywhere in the world is the spear. D&D and a lot of other roleplay games vastly overlook the effectiveness of a spear. Now admittedly, spears are devastatingly effective when used in block formation. It's well documented through European warfare of the Middle Ages, of walls of pikemen being very effective, especially against cavalry. But even on a one-on-one fight, a spear is surprisingly effective. A lot of people pick a spear over a sword, but in a one-on-one fight, I'd actually rather have a spear. Spear, in the hands of somebody who's done some training with it, can be quite effective, because you can employ a lot of the same blocks and parries and movements that you would with a quarterstaff, but you have the added bonus of a sharp, pointy bit at the end that can punch through the links in chainmail. It also, historically, was very prominent in a lot of warrior cultures, as I said. We know from historical records that it was the favoured weapon of the Spartans, which they used to devastating effect. And yet D&D treats spear as a joke weapon, which is kind of a shame. I'm actually thinking about writing some modifications to the fighter class to beef up spear usage so that spears can be taken as a serious weapon again. In addition to spears, we then must ask ourselves, well, when you are fighting with a sword and shield, or in close quarters fighting where the range of a spear is, or the effectiveness of a spear is reduced because you don't have that range. And again, D&D leans really heavily into swords, but we look at a lot of historical stuff, and we find that actually, while swords were popular and common, so were axes and warhammers and picks, and of course the trusty mace. This is my LARP mace. I particularly like this because it is it's actually based on an actual footman's mace. So it is a nice long haft of wood with a meaty head on the end of it. The other thing I particularly like about this is that unlike a lot of LARP maces, it doesn't have the comically oversized mace head that some do. But we can clearly see that it's styled. It has got these kind of ridges here. It's designed for splintering wooden shields and denting armour. See, that's the thing, is that a sword, which is more often than not a slashing weapon, is only so effective against somebody in heavy armour, whereas even against plate mail, you don't need to be able to actually impact the person inside of it. If you can dent their helmet, you can concuss them or worse. So maces, although we frequently associate them in D&D with, say, clerics, a good mace should be a worthwhile consideration for a fighter. Now, Shad talked a lot about the longsword, and like any history aficionado, LARPer, or anybody else that's ever looked at a fantasy or period movie, I have a great deal of love for the sword. Now, he suggests, when he suggests a longsword, he gives an example of a particularly long sword. Now, I'm not sure that sword he's got there is a longsword. I would call that, because a longsword was traditionally about sort of between 100 to 130 centimetres, and that looks significantly longer. I think what he's got there is much more likely to be a two-handed sword, a Zweihander, or Beihander, as it was also known, which is German for both hands. They were closer to about 200 centimeters, which that weapon that Shad's got in the video there certainly looks closer to. But yeah, great swords. Very, very good as a two-handed weapon. But you don't have the functionality of a shield. A lot of weapons and choices of weapons are also indicative of the kinds of armour you might want to wear. So if you're wanting to use a shield, you're going to want to use a shorter weapon like a hammer, a battle axe, a mace, or a short sword, or a one and a half handed sword. If you're fighting more from a ranged stance, then you start to be able to use two-handed swords, Dane axes, spears. I guess the problem for me is that D&D, once again, it leans too much into one thing. I recently had a debate with several people in an online group, and we were talking about the fact that D&D is frequently explained to people as medieval Europe, but with magic. But by the mechanics of the game and the way the flavour of the game is presented, it just doesn't feel like that. We don't have those same weapon focuses and designations like we would in actual history. For instance, Shad talks a lot about the Bec de Corbin. Fantastic weapon. An ideal anti-armoured weapon. It's got a heavy-hitting hammer for denting and breaking the wearer without actually breaking the armour. Not to mention that a lot of Warhammers, and the Bec de Corbin as well, have a pick on the back of them. Now that pick, when swung with sufficient force, will punch through plate mail. The other thing that those sorts of weapons tend to have is spikes on the top. And the main reason for this is, again, it's a very good weapon against cavalry. Knock the guy off his horse, when he's prone on the floor, spin it round and stab him. Punch straight through the plate. This is the thing, is that D&D is very heroic, but a lot of the medieval warfare and the documentation and the accounts that we have of medieval warfare depicts it as being a much more brutal and bloody affair. Now, this is not to say that everybody who went into war in medieval times was guaranteed to die. There are plenty of examples of people who have survived with some pretty horrific injuries. Now, we have to bear in mind that medical technology at the time was not what it is now, and that surgery was something that came much later. So they had basic idea about sewing up wounds. They had, or at least patching and plugging the wound. They had basic principle of being able to set a bone, albeit very crudely. So people were cautious about getting wounded in combat, because being wounded in combat was life-altering. You know, if it didn't kill you, it had a very good chance of at least crippling you or maiming you, and leaving you with lifelong scars and injuries. This isn't something that D&D handles very well. D&D, it doesn't matter whether your fighter is at full 30 hit points or whether he's down to his last hit point. There's no penalty for the injuries that they've received. And for people who like a more gritty, historical-inspired game, it just doesn't meet that requirement. It's something that a lot of people I've spoken to have a problem with D&D and with games of that ilk, is that when you want to play into those kind of more realistic depictions of medieval society and feudal society, that some games just don't hit that mark. I'd love to know what you guys think. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, what your homebrewed erratas and ways of working around this are. You know, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, and we can get a discussion going. like I said, I'm toying around with and going to be writing some stuff for expanding the weapon options for fight, in particular for fighters, but also just for D&D as a whole. So maybe when I've got some of that written up, I'll post links on social media for that. The only way that you'll know for certain is to, of course, follow this channel. You can also follow me on Twitter. All of those links and such will be in the description below. So I'd really appreciate it if you did give this a thumbs up and subscribe, because it really helps the channel out. Hopefully I'll hear from you guys soon, and, you know, if we can get a back and forth going on this, that would be awesome. Until next time, stay nerdy.